This is the first of 2 short films. This first one makes the case that bioethics needs a new genre of review. To be precise about what we're claiming, we need to distinguish between reason-based bioethics, which uses reasoning to address ethical questions, and empirical bioethics, which uses empirical methods to address empirical questions relevant to reason-based bioethics and policymaking. Daniel Streich argued before we began collaborating that empirical bioethics needs systematic reviews. But is there a way to package reason-based bioethics to make it accessible to decision makers, clinical decision makers, writers of medical or research guidelines, researchers, research sponsors? Our claim is that reason-based bioethics needs what we call systematic reviews of reasons. That is, systematic reviews of all the reasons that have been given for or against a particular ethical position. Decision makers, we argue, need to read systematic reviews of reasons, and the rest of us need decision makers to read them. The next short talk explains in greater detail how to write a systematic review of reasons and identifies some key technical and conceptual issues. I need to qualify our claim that reason-based bioethics needs a new genre of review because the idea that clinical bioethics needs systematic reviews is not new. In 2007, Lawrence B. McCullough and colleagues made the case for systematic reviews of clinical bioethics as a tool for clinical decision-making. The position that Daniel and I take differs from that of the McCullough team in 2 key respects. One is scope. We make the case for the broader relevance of these systematic reviews also to policymakers, scientists and economists who provide the informational inputs to policy, and philosophers. The second is in terms of method. We argue that a much more sweeping revision of systematic review methods is needed for systematic reviews of reason-based bioethics to achieve their aims in clinical decision-making and these other contexts. And we go beyond outlining a model by explaining in detail how to write such a systematic review. We hope that a more plausible adaptation of systematic review methodology to reason-based bioethics will result in broader uptake than that of the McCullough team, which has resulted in just 1 systematic review of a 7-article literature written by the same author team. By way of background, a systematic review in medicine or epidemiology addresses a specific empirical research question. The question has a set form. It must mention the population, intervention, comparison, and outcome. An example might be, in humans aged 18 or over, that's the population, does smoking at least 12 cigarettes a day, that's the intervention, compared to smoking less than 12 cigarettes a day, that's a comparison, increase the lifetime incidence of lung cancer, and that's the outcome. A systematic review answers this question based on the entire literature, and it tells us how confidently we should believe the answer. Alternatively, it tells us that the question is not yet settled. Further research is needed. Writing a systematic review follows a detailed protocol that can only be outlined here. After formulating the research question, one conducts a reproducible search designed to identify all the publications that meet predetermined inclusion conditions. The result should be the entire literature that addresses the research question. Then, for each publication, one extracts the overall conclusion, that is, its answer to the research question, and assesses the degree to which we should believe it. Sometimes, and as recommended when writing a systematic review that will inform clinical guidelines, One weights this answer or conclusion to reflect this degree. The systematic review then draws an even-handed conclusion on behalf of the entire literature, taking into account the extent to which we should accept the conclusions drawn by individual publications. The primary purpose of the systematic review has always been to enable decisions that are maximally informed and that are minimally biased. The need for systematic reviews arises because, for most empirical questions, the relevant literature is extensive. Decision makers lack the time and skills to retrieve all the relevant literature, appraise it and synthesize it, that is, to identify the literature's all things considered answer to the research question. Without a systematic review, decisions are likely to be based on a subset of publications, which is probably not representative of the whole literature, and the risk arises that reviewers will consciously or unconsciously cherry-pick, favor publications best supporting their views. So systematic reviews undertake the substantial project of identifying, assessing, and synthesizing the literature using techniques that minimize bias, and then present the synthesis in a format accessible to decision makers. Unsurprisingly, they're used increasingly to make clinical decisions, write guidelines, and set research agendas. The genre emerged in the late 1970s not in medicine but in social science, where it was used to address questions, for example, about the relation between class size and pupil achievement. When it was then adapted to medicine and epidemiology, it reached a high level of sophistication. It has since been used to review qualitative research. Daniel has argued for and used a specific adaptation for empirical bioethics. And as I mentioned, there is one outline model for writing systematic reviews of clinical ethics. We will call this the McCullough model. And then there is our model for writing systematic reviews of reasons. The McCullough model has, we will next argue, three worrying features, which make it a less than informative and perhaps even misleading brief for decision makers. It is also of limited use to social scientists, economists, and philosophers who provide inputs to policy. The McCullough model prescribes the same form of research question as a systematic review as it was developed to review literature on medicine or epidemiology. Here is the McCullough team's research question. In patients with mental disorders, that's the population, is use of concealed medications in food or drink, there's the intervention, rather than prescribing medications in the usual way or forcibly administering them, comparison, ethically justifiable, that's the outcome. Though it passes unremarked by the McCullough team, there is one change from a physical outcome, such as increased mortality, to an ethical outcome, here ethical justifiability. The research question that a McCullough model systematic review answers on behalf of the literature is an ethical question. But if a literature omits reasons or inadequately presents reasons that are potentially strong, the literature's answer to that ethical question can be misleading. This isn't a good enough reason to reject McCullough model systematic reviews because, of course, when an empirical literature is inadequate, its conclusion will also be potentially misleading and uninteresting. The correct safeguard in both cases, that is, inadequate empirical and reason-based literatures, is for the review to conclude that further research is needed to answer the question. However, think of literatures that are not perfect but sufficiently developed to allow reviewers to draw a qualified conclusion. Clinical decision makers are less likely, we surmise, to understand the significance of limitations in reasoning than in study design. Furthermore, if an ethics literature is comprehensive and uniformly excellent, its all things considered conclusion may be one of several conflicting but individually reasonable conclusions that could be drawn from these reasons. In either case, a McCullough model systematic review may seriously mislead decision makers. The second worrying feature of a McCullough model systematic review is the way in which it assesses the degree to which we should believe the ethical conclusion drawn by individual publications. The McCullough team proposes a simple summary measure of, I quote, the adequacy of ethical analysis and argument, unquote, in a publication, which Daniel and I explain in detail in our paper in the journal Bioethics. As we argue in that paper, and we won't give the details here, their measure cannot be used to assess the degree to which we should believe a publication's ethical conclusion. And supposing that we could replace that piece of the McCullough model with an adequate measure, our first lot of objections about the potential to mislead decision makers would still stand. A third serious problem with the McCullough model is that it doesn't require the identification of each type of reason that has been brought to bear on the ethical issue in question, or the implications the reason has been taken to have for the issue, or indeed whether the author accepts or rejects the reason for the conclusion drawn. But why would one need such detailed data on reasons? Surely, one might argue, if the literature omits relevant ethical reasons or presents potentially strong reasons inadequately, a systematic review of these reasons will be just as uninteresting as a McCullough model systematic review, which presents the literature's answer to the ethical question and not this detailed information about the reasons on which the answer is based. Before I answer that question, let me just outline some key features of our alternative model, our model for writing systematic reviews of reasons. Our alternative model holds that the research question should not be an ethical question, but instead the factual question of which reasons have been given when addressing the ethical question. So, for example, our systematic review addressed the question, which reasons have been given for the views that participants in a drug trial should or need not be ensured post-trial access to the trial intervention. Note that despite the fact that the literature to be reviewed is ethical, the research question is factual. But it's a sort of factual question that one can answer from the proverbial philosopher's armchair through desktop research. This slide should help understand the difference in research questions between the traditional systematic review in medicine or epidemiology and the two competing models of systematic reviews of reason-based bioethics, the McCullough team's and ours. A traditional systematic review of medical literature, say, asks a factual question about a physical outcome. For example, to repeat, in humans aged 18 or over, does smoking at least 12 cigarettes a day versus smoking less than 12 cigarettes a day increase the lifetime incidence of lung cancer? A McCullough model systematic review of reason-based bioethics asks a question of the same form, except that the outcome is ethical, not physical. An example might be, in patients with mental disorders, is use of concealed medications in food or drink, rather than prescribing medications in the usual way or forcibly administering them, ethically justifiable? Daniel and I propose a different model which addresses a factual question about reasons. Our example again, which reasons have been given for the views that participants in a drug trial should or need not be ensured post-trial access to the trial drug? The form of the research question has implications for the type of data one needs to collect. To answer our research question, one needs to extract each occurrence of a reason from each publication included in the review and code it to reflect the type of reason it expresses. By the way, we contrast the occurrence of a reason in a publication with a type of reason which might have different occurrences in different publications. One records also whether the reason occurrence is used to argue for or against the view in question. Authors might differ as to the implications of the same reason. One notes also whether the reason is accepted or rejected. A commonly mentioned type of reason might never be endorsed or always rejected. The form of the research question also implies that one does not need to assess the quality of reason occurrences. One can, after all, identify the reasons without saying how good or bad they are. However, information on quality is crucial for decision makers, so we will return to this issue of quality assessment later. Let me now return to this question of why we need such detailed information about reasons. I mentioned earlier this concern that if a literature neglects to mention relevant reasons or inadequately presents reasons that might be strong ones, then a systematic review of reasons might be just as uninteresting as a McCullough model systematic review, which draws the literature's all things considered answer to the research question and doesn't give any of this detailed data about reasons. There are 2 points to make here. The first is that reviews of reasons are needed because decision makers and philosophers need to identify all the relevant reasons and their implications for the decision or ethical issue in question. Now, a review of reasons can't do this hard work for them. The literature it reviews might omit relevant reasons or be wrong about which reasons are relevant or about their implications. However, a review of reasons reduces the risk of neglecting relevant reasons or interpretations of these reasons or their possible implications. The second point is that systematic reviews of reasons, we surmise, reveal a greater range of data than informal reviews of reasons that are usual in bioethics and philosophy. Informal reviews sample literature using unsystematic, undocumented search methods to the point at which it seems to the author, and it's usually a single author, that no new interesting reasons emerge. The systematic review of reasons that Daniel and I conducted identified a far broader range of published reasons, their alleged implications and attitudes taken to the reasons than any informal review of reasons that we identified. We surmise that systematic reviews of reasons in general identify broader ranges of reasons, particularly when a literature is large, fragmented across disciplines and literary genres, and indexed in databases inadequately and inconsistently, as they often are in bioethics. In fact, the rationale for writing systematic reviews of reason-based bioethics may be stronger than in the case of clinical epidemiology. This is because reason-based bioethics is very hard to retrieve, not only for medical professionals and health policists who are not trained to retrieve such sort of literature, but also for librarians and philosophers. A further point in favor of systematic reviews of reasons is that they help to improve the field by identifying gaps such as reasons that have been presented only inadequately or insufficiently developed or distinguished concepts, or factual claims that need testing. For example, our systematic review showed differences between publications on the costs, legality, and logistics of ensuring post-trial access, and suggested that many of the factual claims are not evidence-based. So we surmise reviews of reasons suggest areas for further empirical and philosophical research which would improve the information base for decision-making, whether in a clinic or at the policy level. Again, the relevance of the systematic nature of the review is that a greater variety of these gaps is likely to be identified. Also, a systematic review of reasons doesn't require an assessment of the degree to which we should believe the ethical conclusion drawn by individual publications, so it doesn't need to measure the quality of reasoning in a publication. Now, decision makers still need to identify the strong reasons. Obviously, identifying the published reasons doesn't suffice. However, at present, a considerable amount of research is needed to construct a meaningful measure of the overall quality of reasoning in a publication. Systematic reviews of reasons can, in the meantime, be coupled with papers discussing the strength of the reasons identified. And in any case, as we argue, they improve decision-making even in the absence of quality assessment by maximizing the identification of relevant reasons and areas for further research. An additional consideration is that reviews of reasons avoid giving decision-makers the impression that the literature's all things considered conclusion is the correct one and that they don't present it at all. So, this film has outlined what we mean by a systematic review of reasons and presented a case for writing them. The next film explains in greater detail how to write a systematic review of reasons and identifies some of the many technical and conceptual issues that they raise. Thank you.